The written accounts of the Second Battle of Boonville and the historical narrative built around them give us a unique story hidden among the nearly forgotten local histories. The appearance of a runaway slave on the 19th of October in Independence, Iowa, and the official records of Colonel John C. Kelton detailing the presence of several contraband individuals in the earthworks at Boonville provide a backdrop of human drama and historical depth to an event about which comparatively little is known. That there was a role played by these individuals in the matter of delivered intelligence should not longer be debated. However, these accounts stop short of addressing all of the significant details contained in other letters of correspondence. We first examined a letter written by Private Daniel Smith on 17 September 1861. This letter detailed the presence and involvement of at least 5 runaway slaves. Private Smith mentioned that one of these individuals claimed to be armed, and this is a point which cries out for more follow-up and investigation. If we assume the account from Independence, Iowa is connected directly to the individual, it is worth noting that he is an individual who would have direct involvement in the Second Battle of Boonville. It is also worth noting that he mentions nothing and hints at nothing regarding being armed. But Private Smith's letter, while perhaps not as connected to the events as the story from the Buchanan County Guardian, describes an individual who is joyful, even tickled to death, at his role in bringing down Colonel Brown. There are other connected accounts that exist that could possibly help us shed light on this historical mystery. Many of these accounts referencing the battle in Boonville that occurred on the 13th of September are found in personal letters that were published in local newspapers. One of the first which we could turn to was published in a newspaper out of Tipton, Iowa called the Tipton Advertiser. One of its correspondents from a nearby Coon Creek township published a letter that had a composition date of the 8th of October and detailed an incident that occurred the previous day. This incident was also referred to in the Buchanan County Guardian story of the 22nd of October. The correspondent from Coon Creek wrote of the return of the 5th Iowa from Glasgow to Boonville on the 3rd of October. For a time, Colonel Worthington's regiment was the only Union force, except for Major Epstein's Home Guard, to have a consistent presence in Boonville. Their arrival on that day found the town and its earthworks shared by not just the Home Guards, but also the 37th Illinois and the 9th Missouri Infantry Regiments. Commanded by Colonel Kelton, the 9th Missouri was really an Illinois regiment, but the required amount of regiments requisitioned by the national government was fulfilled before the colonel could ready his muster rolls. Apparently not a man of great patience, Kelton moved his men to St. Louis, where they were then mustered in as a Missouri regiment. This, potentially, is of significance as we further investigate this story. The captain of Company A of the 37th Illinois Volunteer Regiment was a man named Captain John Adams Jordan. Captain Jordan wrote several letters home in early October after the arrival of his regiment, in which he noted a frequent interaction with the secession gentry of Boonville. A more commonly used word 160 years ago, the term gentry refers to those of good breeding and high social status. His family noted that he described himself as receiving many dining invitations from first families. They supposed that his relationship with the secessionists was so good because he sent escaped slaves back to their owners when they turned up at the fortifications. Taking into account the story of the Contraband who appeared in Independence, Iowa on 19 October, the behavior of Captain Jordan towards contrabands is the opposite of the treatment received by the runaway who was befriended by the 5th Iowa. In that regiment, the contraband was befriended and even helped to leave and escape what certainly would have been monotonous work on the fortifications at the capital in Jefferson City. The 37th Illinois, at least the policy of Company A, was very different. It may also explain Colonel Kelton's tone in his correspondence with Assistant Adjutant General Chauncey McKeever. It is that previously examined 6th October correspondence where he sends several slaves to Jefferson City whose masters threatened to kill them. Kelton was the senior officer in charge during his time in Boonville. There is little doubt that he was approached frequently, if not daily, by concerned citizens or perhaps frustrated slave owners seeking the return of those individuals in the earthworks. A significant amount of pressure was also being placed upon Major General John C. Fremont and subsequently his subordinates to give pursuit to the forces of Sterling Price. Kelton, in playing his role, may have grown weary of this disruptive chain of events and may even have come into conflict with Major Epstein over the issue. The previously mentioned missive from 6th October indicates that something happened to change the status quo of the situation. Earlier we mentioned a letter written to the Tipton Advertiser in Iowa that was published on the 24th October issue. The correspondent detailed a controversial issue that took place on 7 October, a Monday, roughly 3 weeks following the Second Battle of Boonville. Having detailed the presence of these other regiments in Boonville, the author then casually mentions an attempt by some secessionists to arrest a slave believed to have belonged to the now deceased Colonel William Brown. The author goes on to mention the death of the colonel and then a startling observation. He states, quote, "It was generally believed that the enemy colonel had been shot by his own slave." The correspondent from Coon Creek Township in Iowa does use specific wording, and it is important to note that he does not state this as a hard fact of occurrence. He rather states this as an unconfirmed story that is rapidly spreading around the town. He further adds the escaped slave was believed to have fled his master's house, come to Boonville, and warned the home guards of the approach of the secessionists. The author further noted that since that event, the individual was protected by Major Epstein's troops. On 7 October, the individual was sent to town with a pass by the major, possibly on business for his new protector. Upon reaching town, some of Colonel Brown's neighbors recognized him and made a successful attempt to detain him. The reference to Colonel Brown's neighbors is of particular importance here. The leader of the secessionist force that attacked Boonville on the 13th of September owned 8 slaves. 5 of these individuals were youths aged 1 through 6. 2 were female, aged 23 and 21, and 1 adult male who was listed as a mulatto, aged 28. They lived in 2 slave dwellings on his roughly 540 acres in the Cambridge Township of Saline County, north of present-day communities Slater and Gilliam. His household consisted of his wife Leona, 3 young children aged 1, 3, and 6, and also 2 laborers, at least one of whom joined him on the expedition to Boonville. The location, by today's standard, is very rural and not quickly accessed. Contemporary and improved roads help the modern traveler, but in most cases, these are much altered from the known maps that detail probable routes in 1861. Any escaped slave would have necessarily kept off the roads. As the crow flies, the shortest route from the approximate location of Colonel Brown's home to the closest bend in the river would have been between 5 and 6 miles. Staying out of sight and keeping to the trees in what was then a more populated and less rural landscape would have been a nerve-wracking task. This does not mean that Brown's adult male slave cannot be one of the men in this tale, but much must be taken into account about how the attack was planned and how this individual may have come to know about it. It is possible that Colonel Brown might have taken his slave along with him on the expedition. Such an occurrence would have played more favorably in the arrival of such information at such a crucial time. We will examine this more in depth in a little bit. For now, let us return to the account from the Tipton Advertiser, which describes in specific details the event involving the runaway slave and the secessionist neighbors of Colonel Brown. The individual was accosted and knocked to the ground. Some home guards saw the abuse and attempted to intervene, but in a confrontation with the secessionist, they were driven away. The home guards hurried off to find reinforcements and returned shortly to confront the mob. The author of the article stated at this point that the second confrontation resulted in the home guard soldiers being unable to identify the escaped slave because of how severely the man's face and head was battered and that his clothing had been destroyed so that there was no easy way to identify him. This detail seems odd. It is difficult to envision the home guards being unable to recognize the individual. Certainly the help did not come instantly, but the home guard should have been able to recognize the man, or at least his captors. The author uses the words "some of Colonel Brown's neighbors." This is the only indication of crowd size that he gives. Perhaps the unruly crowd was large enough that the home guards were unable to successfully rescue the man without harm to themselves. Having thwarted the home guard a second time, these men moved towards the old jail on Morgan Street. They again ran into members of Union forces, but this time they were not from the home guard, they were from the 5th Iowa. The author states the number to be 3 or 4 and does not seem to indicate that he was a participant in this affair. He goes on to describe the interaction between these factions, detailing how the unfortunate captive managed to free himself from a gag and pled his story, upon which the Iowans pitched in and routed the rebels, taking the man back to camp. There he is said to have stayed with officers, saying that he would not be taken again without a fight. This harrowing story is told by an individual who is undoubtedly connected to the event, though he is likely a secondary source retelling the account. The story is consistent with the attitudes displayed by other members of the 5th Iowa who befriended another escaped slave who was mentioned in the Buchanan County Guardian and who appeared in Independence, Iowa on the 19th of October. There is some timeline discrepancy in these accounts. The man in Iowa could not have left on the 6th of October as he indicated if he was a witness or privy to this incident with the secessionist mob, as written evidence places that event on the 7th of October. It seems possible that Colonel Kelton, possibly to defuse a situation in town, sought to relocate these runaway slaves. What is certain is that a pass was no protection for one of these particular individuals. We do not know what business brought him away from the fortifications, but there are 2 accounts that suggest it nearly cost the man his life. Such an occurrence probably had a drastic effect on the other slaves' outlook. At least one decided to forego being sent to Jefferson City. His storied arrival in Independence give us the only documented account of any of these people following the 7th of October. They are afterwards, at least for now, lost to history. Let us examine this factor. Secessionists, including those who were neighbors of Colonel Brown, knew that contraband slaves were being harbored in the earthworks. It is almost certain that there was a belief that in some way they were responsible for the defeat of the Missouri State Guard's attack. Some sources of the time specifically state with certainty that these individuals were responsible for bringing intelligence to Major Epstein. There is confirmation of this as a fact in the official records. There is also a suggestion that these individuals were participants in the battle, though these accounts are of a secondary nature and thus far lack specific connected narratives that would make this a proven fact. Let us now turn to some of these other accounts to ascertain the veracity of this story.